put 2 bullets in his brain. Carlos was a son, he was a father, he was a husband, he was a youth basketball coach. But like all of us, Carlos had a lot of demons, and you're going to hear about those too. And through the course of the trial, you're going to find out that Carlos used crack cocaine. And through the course of the trial, you're going to find out that Carlos sometimes sold marijuana. But this case is not about how Carlos lived. We are gathered here today not to talk about how Carlos lived, but rather to talk about how he died. We're here today, gathered in this courtroom, to talk about what Vivian Wires saw, his wife of almost 30 years, when she went downstairs in their house on November 23rd, 2015. We're here today to talk about what left Carlos Wires looking like that. On November 23rd, 2015, Vivian Wires was in her bed. She woke up with indigestion, and when she woke up, she heard what she described as a tussle going on downstairs, and then she heard 2 loud bangs. And she walked downstairs, and she saw what you just saw on that screen. And the question that went through her head, the question that you're here to answer, is who did that? How could that have happened to her husband? And through the course of the trial, we will show you, we will prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is the one who did that, that the defendant is the one who is responsible. The defendant is the answer to that question. Vivian went downstairs when she heard that tussle, when she heard those loud bangs, to find her husband, and she saw through the haze, the smoke that she'll describe, the gun smoke that she smelled. She walked through that, and she walked out the front door, and she called out to her husband, "Carlos, are you there?" But Carlos didn't answer because Carlos couldn't answer. She walked back inside, and that's when she saw what you just saw on that screen. Now, I will be honest with you. Through the course of the trial, you will learn that nowhere in that house was a fingerprint that belongs to the defendant. And nowhere in that house is there any DNA that conclusively matches the defendant. And you'll also learn that Vivian Wires admitted to the police and will admit to you that when she went into the house, she saw a bag of marijuana, and she picked it up and she grabbed it and she threw it outside, and she got gunshot residue on it. She'll admit that to you. And no doubt the defense will harp on the fact that there was no fingerprint and no DNA found in the house. But that, folks, is not where the investigation ended. That's not where the case ended. And that's not where the trial ended. Because if we go back before 11:45 p.m., about an hour and 15 minutes, until about 10:15, 10:20, you'll learn that Carlos Wires borrowed his daughter's phone. He borrowed his daughter Shelby's phone, and he made a phone call. He made 2 phone calls. And Shelby was there, and Shelby heard her father on the phone ask for someone named Steve. And he left a message. And Shelby will tell you a few minutes later, she got a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered the phone, and the voice on the phone said, "Did somebody call for Steve?" Shelby handed the phone to her father, and her father had a conversation with that person on the phone. She heard her father say, "Come on over." Father gave her the phone back, and she left shortly thereafter. It was the last time she saw her father alive. Now that voice on the phone, the voice that said, "Did somebody call for Steve?" was a voice that Shelby will tell you she will never forget. A voice that she identified at a voice lineup. A voice that she will take the witness stand and identify here in court in front of you as belonging to the defendant. did somebody call for Steve? We know it was the defendant's phone because Alana Dawson, his own girlfriend, remembers getting a phone call on that day, on that night. And she remembers having somebody ask for Steve. And she remembers that she called Steve to tell him that he had gotten a message. We know it was his phone. That same phone, the phone with the voice that Shelby will tell you belongs to the defendant, the voice that said, did somebody call for Steve? The phone that Alana Dawson will tell you about, well, about 10 minutes before Carlos Wires was shot twice in the head, that phone was using a cell phone tower in Quincy, Illinois. The cell phone tower that was closest to Carlos Wires' house. Now, a little bit before 11:45, Michael Gay is walking on 4th Street. He's walking by Carlos Wires' house. And he sees Carlos outside the house, and he has a short conversation with him. Carlos says something to him about avoiding a stick on the sidewalk. He talks to him about that, and he walks away. And as he's walking away, he notices something parked in front of Carlos's house. A car. A red car. A distinctive red car that Michael Gay later identified as belonging to the defendant's mother. And after Michael Gay walked away, just a few minutes later, he heard the sirens of the first responders as they was coming to Carlos Wires' house. At the same time, on 5th Street, standing on the corner is David Scott. David Scott's talking to a friend. And he hears 2 gunshots. And just a minute after he hears those 2 gunshots, he sees a car driving away from Carlos Wires' house, driving down 5th Street. A red car. A distinctive red car that he later identifies as belonging to the defendant's mother. And driving that distinctive red car, driving away from Carlos Wires' house, driving away from Carlos Wires' house, just a minute after he heard 2 gunshots, driving that car was the defendant, whose name just happens to be Steve. Between midnight and 1 a.m., Robert McPhail gets a phone call. He gets a phone call from the defendant. It's not strange because he and the defendant are friends. The defendant asked him to pick him up somewhere. Robert will tell you, well, that was a little strange because the defendant asked him to pick him up at a location that he's never picked him up before. But Robert goes and picks him up and drives him to where Robert was staying, a trailer on the north side of Quincy. When they get to the trailer, the defendant asks him for a change of clothes. And Robert will tell you he found that a little strange. The defendant had never asked him for a change of clothes before. Robert will tell you the defendant asked him to run an errand for him too. That he wanted to go pick up some cigarettes and some iced tea, and he gave Robert a $20 bill. Robert will tell you that was a little unusual because the defendant had a big wad of money in his hand. And it was the end of the month. And in the time that he had known the defendant, he had never seen the defendant with a big wad of money at the end of the month. But he took the $20 bill and he went to a store to get the cigarettes and to get the iced tea. And as he was in line, he was looking at that $20 bill and he noticed something about it. He noticed that it had fresh blood. Robert goes back to the trailer, and in the trailer are Teron Cartmill and the defendant. And they're talking. Now Robert doesn't know what they said or what they talked about, but Teron Cartmill does. And he's going to tell you that after Robert left, he and the defendant had a conversation. And Teron's going to tell you that Robert's right, that the defendant asked for a change of clothes. and that he found that unusual, and that the defendant had a big wad of money in his hands. And he found that unusual at the end of the month. And that big wad of money that the defendant had in his hands had blood on it. And Teron Hartwell is going to tell you what the defendant said that blood was and where it came from. Teron Hartwell will tell you the defendant said, I shot and killed Carlos' wife. That he went over to Carlos' house because he was going to sell Carlos some crack cocaine. And they got into an argument about the purchase price. The defendant wanted $100, and Carlos only wanted to pay $80. And Carlos got out some money that he had, a wad of money, and that made the defendant mad that he wasn't going to get paid what he thought he was supposed to get paid, $20 more. And so he went back out to his car, and he got his gun, and he went back inside, and he pointed the gun at Carlos, and Carlos looked at him and said, what are you going to do? Kill me while my family's upstairs? And that's exactly what he did. He put 2 bullets in his brain. And then he reached down, and he ripped that money out of Carlos' dead hands. He didn't get all of it because you're going to see photographs showing money, bloody money, in Carlos' hands. I told you, to be honest with you, Robert McPhail and Teron Hartwell are convicted felons. They are. They're users of heroin as well. But the evidence will show they didn't get one thing for their testimony, not one promise, not one inducement, not one benefit, not one day off of any criminal sentence. They didn't get anything. And the next morning, Vicki Shumpler, who's not a convicted felon, Vicki Shumpler was in her apartment, and she heard a lot of voices. She went upstairs, and she saw the defendant. She heard him talking. She recognized his voice. And she heard the defendant talking about taking bloody money to a gas station in the morning before. That's what the evidence is, folks. That's what it will be. That is how we know what happened that night. That's the answer to Vicki's question. That's the answer to the questions that you're hearing. That's how we know the defendant did it. That's how we know the defendant's a murderer. That's how we know that he's a killer. That's how we know that he put 2 bullets in the brain of Carlos Juarez. And at the end of the trial, that's why we're going to ask you to return a verdict of guilty. Not because I ask you to, but because it's the only verdict that the evidence will support, that the law requires, and that justice will demand.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Mr. Lovelace.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. What we're doing here is opening statements. It's not evidence. In fact, the state has only at this point told you what they believe the evidence will show. It will be up to the state to present this evidence in the form of testimony or exhibits, and to prove that Steven committed the crime that they've charged him of beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, on November 23rd of 2015, Carlos Juarez was shot twice. It was a tragedy for Carlos Juarez to lose his life in that manner. But Steven Gavin did not shoot him. During the course of the investigation, the Quincy Police Department conducted a gunshot residue test. And you will learn that someone, not Steven Gavin, tested positive for gunshot residue on their hand. So I'm sure you're wondering, why are we here? Why is Steven Gavin here? And why does the state have all these witnesses that they're talking about that are going to say that Steven Gavin committed this crime? For the answers to those questions, You have to look at it in the investigation. On November 23rd of 2015, after the shooting, the Quincy Police Department went in and started an investigation. They collected evidence from the living room of Carlos Weyer's home. That evidence that they collected included fingerprints. It included items throughout the living room. It included money. It included drug, and it also included gunshot residue. They took pictures of Carlos Weyers, one of the pictures that you've already seen up there. They had an autopsy done. They even took clippings of Carlos Weyers' fingernails to be tested. And they processed all this evidence. And with the help of the Illinois State Police, they processed it to determine if there was any DNA on those items. They also interviewed witnesses. Immediately they began the process of interviewing witnesses in this case. They interviewed the people that were in bars around Carlos Weyer's home, where he had supposedly been just before the shooting. And all this evidence that they collected, none of it points to Steven Gavin. There's none of Steven's DNA. There's none of Steven's fingerprints. And nobody that night who was interviewed said that Steven Gavin was at those bars or that he was at the Carlos Weyers home. So what happened? The Quincy Police Department did not follow the evidence, the physical evidence. Instead, they followed the word on the street. And the word on the street came from one of the first suspects, a person that the state mentioned in Michael Gay, who admitted to being in front of Carlos Weyers' house and actually speaking to Carlos Weyers just before the shooting. And from there, the Quincy Police Department decided on a prime suspect. Not Michael Gay, but Steven Gavin. That is until 4 months later they got the results of the gunshot residue test that showed that someone had gunshot residue on their hand, someone else, not Steven Gavin. It was then that the Quincy Police Department had a decision to make. Follow the physical evidence and refocus the investigation on the evidence that they had collected, or continue to follow rumors, gossip, and the word on the street. And they chose gossip and rumors. I'm not sure why the Quincy Police Department did that, why they made that decision to chase rumors and gossip. Maybe it's because at that point they really couldn't collect any more evidence from the Weyers home. They couldn't go into the other rooms 4 months later and collect evidence. They couldn't go upstairs. They couldn't go into the bedroom and collect the evidence that they didn't collect back on November 23rd of 2015. And they couldn't collect evidence on the person that now had tested positive for gunshot residue. And it took almost another year after that for the Quincy Police Department to find these other witnesses that the state has talked about. Witnesses who are addicted to drugs, witnesses who have been charged with crimes, that have been in trouble with the law, people with problems and felonies and people with reasons to lie and to say that Steven Gavin committed this crime. It's interesting that the state went to all the expense to process this evidence that they collected from the living room, the gunshot residue, the DNA, the fingerprints, the fingernail clippings. They took pictures of the living room. They took pictures of Carlos Weyer's body. They drew diagrams. And none of this points to Steven Gavin. I suspect if it did, if the science pointed to Steven Gavin, you would be wondering why Steven's DNA and fingerprints are in the Carlos Weyer's home. But that's not the case. We're not here to prove Steven innocent, because as he sits here today, he's presumed innocent. But we are here to ask the tough and sometimes uncomfortable questions so that you can hold the state to their burden of proof. Guilty or not guilty, that's going to be your decision. It's not mine, it's not the state's, and it's not the judge's. However, it is the state's burden of proof. And I know you're going to hold them to that burden of proof because you promised to do so. And in doing so, I believe that you will find Steven Gavin not guilty.
Thank you, Mr. Lovelace.